I can hear the rumble, bold as distant thunder, as 100 tons of steel roars down the track. Train comes round the horseshoe turn, headlights beam, then it storms into the station with a rush of steam. All aboard as we climb inside, and we know that we're in for an exciting ride. Like the real live version of a Lionel train, it's the great railway adventures. There's not a thing to lose and the world to gain on the great railway adventures.
Hi, I'm LeVar Burton, and the story that I'm going to read is called The Mighty Mogul. It was written by Lynn Oliver with illustrations by Jeffrey Lindbergh. All aboard! Gazing out the classroom window, Jim Prescott was surprised to see a storm coming in over the prairie. Just that morning, the March sky had been blue as a jay. At recess, he and his friends had played hide and seek in the new grass, glad that spring had finally arrived. Now, as Jim watched the dark clouds spread like a blanket over the Kansas plains, he could feel the cold of winter returning. At the front of the room, Katie Riley was busy reading a story to her students. Suddenly, a cold wind blew the door open and whipped the book right out of her hands. A worried look crossed her face. This was no ordinary storm. Jim thought Miss Riley was the kindest teacher in all the world. On cold days, she made cocoa for the children on the school's pot-bellied stove. On hot days, she brought them pitchers of icy lemonade. She read them stories about fierce giants and fire-breathing dragons. Miss Riley's eyes always seemed to be smiling, but they were not smiling now. "Children," she said, her voice full of concern, "I'm closing school. I want you all to hurry home." "But what about the story?" asked Charlie Lawson. "You were just getting to the good part." "It'll have to wait," Miss Riley answered. "This storm looks dangerous." Snow was already falling as the children rushed out the door of the little red schoolhouse. Jim took Charlie's hand. By the time they crossed the fields, the snow was coming down so thick that the boys could hardly see. They were cold and wet and 2 miles from home. In the distance, Jim heard the clanging of a brass bell, followed by the steady chug-chug-chugging of a train. A big smile spread across his face. "That's Skeet!" hollered Jim. "What's a skeet?" asked Charlie. "It's not a what, it's a who," answered Jim. "Skeet's my uncle, and he's the engineer of the Mogul. Come on, we're in luck." Jim and Charlie raced toward the railroad tracks. As the Mogul approached, Jim felt his heart beat fast, the way it always did when he heard the mighty freight engine thundering like an iron horse across the plains. Skeet leaned out of the train as it rolled to a stop. "Hey there, Jumbo," he called, flashing his handsome grin. "You two look like you could use a lift." He held out his hand. "Hop into my living room." Jim and Charlie climbed aboard the locomotive. The heat from the smoldering coal warmed the engine's cabin. Jim held his freezing hands over the firebox and sighed with relief. He always felt safe when Uncle Skeet was around. The Mogul made its way along the track, stopping at the covered bridge that separated Jim's family farm from Charlie's. "What's the opposite of all aboard?" Charlie asked as Uncle Skeet lifted him down from the train. "Oh, skedaddle," Skeet laughed. "And that means you. I've got to step on it if I'm going to make it to St. Louis by noon tomorrow." "Will you be safe out here?" Jim asked. "It's snowing awful bad." "Don't you worry, Jimbo," said Uncle Skeet. "This is the mighty Mogul. She can handle any trick Mother Nature has tucked up her sleeve." Then, with a wink of his eye and a clang of the Mogul's brass bell, Uncle Skeet was off. All that night, the blizzard raged. Snow fell thick as cotton. Wind whipped through the sycamore trees, sending branches flying. At Jim's farm, the upstairs window shattered and the roof of the old barn caved in. Ma stayed close to the fire, rocking the baby. Pa and Jim barely made it out to feed the animals. For 2 days and 2 nights, the snowstorm pounded the countryside. When at last it ended, it had touched every farm and every family. No one escaped its fury. Miss Riley stood in front of the little schoolhouse. Although she tried not to cry, she couldn't stop the tears from flowing. Her beloved school lay before her, ruined. The roof had caved in, and the red walls were flattened as if a giant had crushed them under his feet. The books were soaked, the map was torn, and the slates were broken to bits. Even the old pot-bellied stove had been smashed by a fallen beam. The children tried to comfort Miss Riley. "We'll build a new school," said Jim softly. Miss Riley shook her head. The storm had hit all the farms for miles around. People would have to use every spare penny to rebuild. No, there would be no money for a new school. In the months that followed, Miss Riley tried to make the best of it. When the sun warmed the ground, she held class in the yard. She taught letters and numbers by drawing them in the dirt with a stick. She had no books, but she told the children stories from her imagination. They had spelling bees and played duck, duck, goose. Jim knew, though, that without a real building, they would not be able to start school in the fall. All through the summer, Jim worked in the fields, helping Pa tend the crops. Every week, they went to town to see Uncle Skeet when he came through on his run. One day, they saw Miss Riley talking to Charlie Lawson. Charlie had tears in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Jim asked, although deep in his heart, he knew. "I'm leaving next Saturday on the stagecoach," Miss Riley said. "I have to look for another job." "I told her not to go," said Charlie, stifling a sob. "We want her to stay with us, don't we, Jim?" Miss Riley was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "We have lost our school," she said sadly. "There is no place for me to teach here, so I must leave. I want you children to remember what I've taught you and know that I love you very much. Never forget that." Skeet saw how much Miss Riley loved the children and how deeply they would miss her. He saw the sad look in Jim's eyes. He knew something had to be done. The Mogul was waiting on the nearby track, loaded with logs, wheat, corn, and cattle. One car stood empty. "You see that empty boxcar, Jimbo?" said Uncle Skeet. "I was thinking, a person could put a lot of building supplies in there, enough to, say, build a new school." Jim just stared at his uncle. That man had the craziest ideas. "Where would this person get the supplies?" Jim asked. "I'm heading out on my St. Louis run," said Uncle Skeet. "I passed through a lot of towns along the way, towns filled with nice folks who might be able to part with things they're not using, if someone like yourself were to ask them, that is." "Me?" said Jim, his eyes growing wide. "Do you really think anyone would give me supplies to build a new school?" "You never know unless you try," said Uncle Skeet. He threw his arm around Jim's shoulders. "Come with me, Jimbo. I've got the train if you've got the nerve." That very day, Jim and his uncle set out aboard the Mogul. Jim wasn't sure he could save Miss Riley's school, but he knew he had to try. The Mogul wove its way across the plains, stopping at each town along the route. While Skeet took care of train matters, Jim talked to folks about his school. He told them how it had been destroyed by the storm and about the wonderful teacher who had lost her job. He spoke from the heart. The people listened and felt his sorrow, yet no one had anything to give. Then one day, in the tiny town of Cottonwood Falls, something surprising happened. An old farmer heard Jim talking and tapped him on the shoulder. "Son," said the farmer, "I never got the chance to go to school. I admire you for wanting to get an education. My wife and I have a big stack of wood left from when we took down our old barn. We'd be real proud if you'd use it to build your school." "Thank you, sir." Jim shook the farmer's hand. "You have no idea what this means to me." Another man stepped up. "I don't have much," he said, "but I've got a hammer and nails you're welcome to." A woman in the crowd offered Jim her calico curtains. The station master took down a map of Kansas and handed it to Jim. "You youngsters might want this in that new school of yours," he said with a smile. Word of what happened in Cottonwood Falls spread like seeds in the wind. Suddenly, everyone wanted to help the boy who cared enough to build a school. From Wichita to St. Louis, people lined up at train stations to contribute anything they could. In Emporia, a widow gave Jim a collection of her husband's treasured books. At Fort Spring, the soldiers gathered crates of red bricks. In Council Grove, a woman gave Jim a rug she had sewn by hand. Another family donated a pot-bellied stove, and children offered their own slates and chalk. By Saturday morning, the boxcar was full, bursting with enough supplies to build a fine new schoolhouse. Jim couldn't wait to show Miss Riley. He looked up at the sky. A storm was blowing in from the west. He knew that bad weather could make them late. "Let's get going," Jim said to Uncle Skeet. "We've got to catch Miss Riley." Rain poured down as the Mogul chugged along the tracks. Hours later, when the train reached the covered bridge near Jim's house, the river was rising fast. "I'm not sure if the bridge will hold," he said, pulling to a stop. "Maybe we should wait here until the storm is over." "That could be hours," said Jim. "If we miss the stagecoach, I'll never see Miss Riley again. You have to try, Uncle Skeet. Just like you always say, you never know unless you try." Skeet scratched his chin and looked out at the rushing water. The bridge looked all right. "This engine and I have crossed many a bridge and many a storm," he said. "I don't suppose this one's any different. Hang on, Jimbo." Skeet eased open the throttle, and the mighty Mogul sailed safely across the covered bridge. When the Mogul arrived in town, Jim hurried to see the station master. "Miss Riley's stagecoach left 2 hours ago," he told Jim. "Oh, no," Jim groaned. "We'll never catch up." "Don't you worry, Jimbo," said Uncle Skeet. "This is the mighty Mogul you're riding in. She can outrun a team of horses any day." Jim jumped into the cab, and the engine took off. Before long, Jim could see the dust from the stagecoach in the distance, and in no time, they were side by side with the horses. Skeet clanged the Mogul's brass bell. "Miss Riley!" yelled Jim, waving at her from the engine window. We did it! We're going to build you the most beautiful schoolhouse in the whole country." People from miles around volunteered to help, and before long, the new school was finished. They painted the outside red, built shelves for the books, laid down the rug, put in the stove, and hung the calico curtains. There was even enough wood left for a bell tower, although there was no money for a bell. It might not have been the most beautiful schoolhouse in the country, but to Miss Riley and her children, there was none better. On the first day of school, Charlie Lawson ran up to Miss Riley, holding out a book. "Now can you read us a story?" he asked. Miss Riley hugged him hard. "Yes, Charlie," she said. "Now I can read you lots and lots of stories." She took Jim's hand. "We have Jim to thank for that." Surrounded by the children she loved, Miss Riley walked into her new school. One day, not long after that, Uncle Skeet came to the schoolyard carrying a big box. "Hello, Miss Riley," he said with a grin. "I've brought you a little something." Miss Riley opened the box. Inside was a shining brass bell. Carved on the front in bold letters were the words, "The Mogul." "I know you were needing a bell for the school, and it sure would mean a lot to me if you'd take the one from the Mogul," Skeet said. "I've been saving up for it for quite a spell." "It's beautiful," said Miss Riley. She looked into Skeet's eyes. They were smiling, just like hers. They hung the brass bell in the school's tower. It rang when Uncle Skeet and Miss Riley got married the next year. It rang when Jim graduated from school. And it rang when Charlie Lawson graduated too. It still rings to this day from its place in the tower, high above the little red schoolhouse that the mighty Mogul helped to build.